what does the Bible say about women preaching in the church?
Good night. We're out of time. It said end at 7:10.
We have 4 minutes left.
Shoot.
All right, let's see it.
So you only have like 2 passages where Paul has these things where he says a woman shouldn't, teach or preach in the church.
So the 2 passages being mentioned here are 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 and 35, and 1 Timothy 2, verses 8 through 14. And they basically say that women are to keep silent in church and they're not to exercise any authority. The first thing to note here is that the scholarly consensus is that 1 Timothy, as one of the pastoral epistles, was not written by Paul, but was written decades after his death, probably the end of the 1st or the beginning of the 2nd century CE. And so it is not Paul giving the lengthier and more vociferous condemnation of women exercising authority and speaking up in church. That leaves us with 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 and 35. However, many scholars think that this is actually a late addition to the chapter, probably from someone related to whatever was going on in 1 Timothy. And there are a few different reasons for thinking that. Right before in this chapter, we have Paul addressing brothers and sisters, talking about when they come together, they have a prayer, a revelation, a lesson, a hymn, and so on. And then right after this, it goes back to talking about brothers and sisters, what you're doing when you're getting together to do these things. And prophecy is one of the big deals, and we have in 1 Corinthians 11 a discussion about prophecy as well. And there's no indication that women are not involved in the prophesying there. It's basically just saying women cover your heads. Additionally, some of the early manuscripts that we have from 1 Corinthians actually move verses 34 and 35 to after verse 40. Now, this is not an indication that there was some kind of mix-up, that we have an earlier manuscript where this wasn't a part of the text. It is an indication that the early scribes couldn't make sense of why it was in the place it was. It didn't seem like it belonged in the position it did, because we have this discussion about disorder and prophecy, and then we have these 2 verses basically saying women shut up, and then we come back to talking about disorder and prophecy. And so it is moved in some manuscripts, which contributes to the conclusion that maybe this is something that's coming later. So probably the stronger patriarchal perspective is coming decades after Paul's death and is being added to some of Paul's letters. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that Paul is a strong ally. We see in 1 Corinthians 11 passages that are nowhere argued to be Deutero-Pauline, Paul saying that man is head of the woman, just like Jesus is head of the man. So there is a hierarchy here. The patriarchy is coming through strong in Paul's genuine writings. But what we have about women shutting up in church is probably coming decades after.
But then you have like this large swath of stuff, like Ephesians chapter 4. He goes, people should be apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers, but he never ties a gender to that. He just says, these are the gifts of the church. Apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher. He never goes, and these can only be men. He just does it in like this one 1 Timothy thing. So then I started delving into that, and I started realizing what was happening in that church in Ephesus was there was a woman cult, and she was a fertility goddess, and they were basically part of a false religion, and it was the false ideas were coming into the church through the women. So what Paul does is he goes, I don't want a woman to teach, but he didn't mean, I think, in no church ever, he was saying, Timothy, stop the ladies from talking, because they're spreading a whole bunch of terrible ideas around your church at this moment in 54 AD, not in every church in the underground church in China in 2023.
So this strikes me as an attempt to try to historically and rhetorically situate Paul's rhetoric here so that it can be dismissed as historically and rhetorically and socially contingent and therefore not generalizable to all congregations across all time and space. And certainly there's validity to that. The authors of these passages are not looking 2,000 years down the road. They're not looking beyond their own society. So they're absolutely contingent on the social frameworks that were in circulation at that time. However, I don't know that there are any data that support this notion that this was Paul responding to attempts to try to disseminate this fertility cult, and that the ideas about women remaining silent were exclusively aimed at that dissemination of the practices of that fertility cult. I know of no data that support that. I think we are better off not trying to rehabilitate Paul, and instead acknowledging that Paul and the pastor who came after him were just deeply embedded in a very patriarchal and misogynist society that had a very strong hierarchy that subordinated women to men as inferior. We already jettison so much about Paul's rhetoric as a society today. We don't care about Paul's ideas about staying in the circumstances in which you were when God called you. Paul was saying that because the time was short. We don't have time to go through these big life changes, so stay as you were. Jesus didn't come back right away, and that's part of what the pastoral epistles are trying to renegotiate. And so we've jettisoned that. We've jettisoned Paul's ideas about celibacy being the priority, the higher law that we should all strive for, that we should only get married if we can't hack celibacy. We've jettisoned all that. We've jettisoned Paul's approval of slavery, the notion that enslaved people need to remain obedient to their masters. It has no use for us, so we've largely jettisoned that. We will jettison this misogyny at some point as well. All we're waiting on is for a critical mass of people to come to the realization that this is just an identity marker that is meaningful and useful for the structuring of power and values and for the engaging in boundary maintenance to serve the identity politics of more conservative Christians. Once more people become aware that that's the reason they're being conditioned to spread this misogyny, they will get over it. That does not happen by sharing facts and data. There is plenty of research that shows what's necessary is for people to have personal experiences or personal relationships with people that allow them to lower their guard and think critically about these things.